Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 17th to 23rd of May, 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host, Jean Deville. Before getting started this week, a special shout out to our excellent fans who helped make our episode from last week go a little bit viral. So we saw a little over 1,600 views on YouTube at the moment. So thank you all for that. That's pretty cool to see that there is indeed interest in the Chinese space sector. And very small reminder, as we had mentioned last week, we now have a newsletter with even more insights and updates on the Chinese space sector. So if you have not signed up yet, you can find that on our website. So recommend the newsletter. Getting back to the podcast, another shout out to Go Taikonauts and Spacewatch.global, two excellent sources of space industry news, and highly recommend to go check them out as well. This week is an excellent and astonishing week to be covering the Chinese space sector. So we have updates on a 20-ton space station that is now getting set up in orbit and readying itself for the arrival of a handful of Taikonauts in the coming weeks. We have proof that SASTIND works on public holidays because it was the Buddha's birthday this week, and we got an announcement from SASTIND. We also have an interesting opinion piece from the CEO of Galaxy Space, one of China's leading commercial satellite manufacturers. But first, Jean will bring us news on the event that has captivated the world this week, the emergence of the Zhurong rover onto the surface of Mars and the associated photos being sent back from the surface.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
So, Jean, the world has been watching, and Zhurong has finally come out of its shell. What's the situation?
Yeah, definitely. This was a very eventful week for the Chinese space program and for the Mars program. And this is sort of as a follow-up to last week's episode where we saw China's Zhurong rover and lander land successfully on Mars. This week, as you mentioned, we got back the first images that Zhurong sent back to the Earth. And so let's have a quick view at these two images that Zhurong sent back and discuss them a little bit. So the first image comes from the hazard avoidance camera at the front of the rover. The image is in black and white, and that's probably because for obstacle avoidance, what you want is the best resolution possible. You don't need color. You don't need that biofilter in front of the camera chip that provides color, but at the detriment of resolution. A few more comments on this image. For hazard avoidance, you probably want to have as wide a view as possible to squeeze as much of the surroundings into the camera field of view. And this is what we can see on this image. This generally creates a sort of a distortion over straight lines as you would have if you were filming with a GoPro. And you can see this with the horizon on this picture. This distortion can be removed by image processing software like Photoshop. And that's what some space fans have done. So I'll put up a picture of that as well to get a better feeling of what Utopia Planitia looks like, and definitely looks like a very flat place based on what we can see from this corrected image. You can also see on this first image sent back by Zhurong, the low frequency ground penetrating radar antennas, which are part of some of the instruments that are on the Zhurong rover. And the idea here is that these antennas, they emit radio frequency waves, which then penetrate the ground. They are reflected on sublayers in the Martian underground. They reach back to the rover, and these reflected waves are then measured. And based on some data processing that you can do to these reflected waves, you have indications on the composition of the Martian underground. So that's also very cool. And last thing that's very cool also on this picture is you see these skinny little ramps which Zhurong rides to drive off the lander. So yeah, that does look a little perilous if you ask me. The second image comes from the navigation camera, and this is on mast at the front of the rover, and it's here on this picture. It's pointed at the back of the rover, and on this picture you can see really two rear deployable solar panels which have deployed correctly. And these solar panels, it's not really visible on the picture, but they're actually quite big compared to the size of the rover. And especially when you compare the size of these solar panels to the solar panels that were on other Chinese rovers, such as the U-2 and U-22 that are on the moon. And the main reason for that is because Mars is so much further away from the sun than the moon. the solar energy that is received per unit of surface is much lower, so you need a larger solar panel. You have to add also the fact that, well, there are dust storms on Mars, and so dust can also reduce significantly the efficiency of these solar panels. So that's for the solar panels. And you can also see on this image a high gain antenna, which is used to communicate either with the orbiter or with the Earth. So really cool stuff, and also a color image. So that's all good. One last thing that's interesting to note on these two images, which were the first two images that Zhurong sent back, was these images were sent back on the 19th of May, while Zhurong landed on Mars on the 16th of May. So there was a lot of discussion. Why did it take 4 days for Zhurong to send back these images, and why did CNSA reveal them only 4 days later? And actually, there's a technical explanation to that. And for that, let's just do a quick rundown of how the rover communicates with the Earth. There's what seems like the more straightforward communication method, which is directly with the Earth. Indeed, that is possible with that high gain antenna that we saw just now. And the rover communicates in X-band with the Earth. But due to the fact that Mars is just so far away from the Earth, and you add to the fact that, well, that antenna that's on board the rover is not that big, and there's also power restrictions on board what the rover can do, well, basically, you have a very slow data transfer rate that's around 16 bits per second, which is definitely not a lot. And you have to add to the fact that, Mars is also spinning around itself. It rotates, obviously. And that means that the rover is not always on the side that's facing the Earth, meaning that actually it only has a window of about 30 minutes every day to communicate with the Earth. So you factor that in as well, and you realize that this is definitely not the best method to send bulky files such as images. So this direct communication method is actually mostly used for sending just the status of the rover, and images. The images use another way of communication. And so the second way of communication is an indirect way where you use the Tianhe orbiter as a relay satellite. And this is much more efficient, and it's the main way of communication. And so how this works is that, well, the rover has a UHF antenna that sends the data to the orbiter, then the orbiter sends it back to the Earth. But this is not as easy as it sounds, because the orbiter is not always necessarily flying over, Zhurong. It also is in an orbit around Mars. And so, yeah, it's not always over the rover. And second point is it's in a highly elliptic orbit, meaning that its closest point to the Martian surface is 265 kilometers, which sounds pretty good, but its furthest point is 15,000 kilometers. And so we can expect that the data transfer can mostly only takes place when the orbiter is rather, closer to Zhurong. So when you factor all that in, even this communication between the rover and the orbiter, I think there's only an 8 to 10 minutes communication window for the rover to upload data, and that those 8-10 minutes is equals approximately to 20 megabits. So you do understand why I think this is the main technical reason. It's the technical reason that was put forward as well by CNSA regarding why, it took a couple of days to send back these first images. And I think you can also think of the fact that the lander landed on the 16th, and there's probably more critical data to send back over the first 1 or 2 days than just images. So yeah, that's just some background on why it took so long. You can also, if you compare with maybe US Mars missions where images potentially came back earlier, you have to also take into account that the US has multiple orbiters around Mars, whereas China only has one. So more constraints for China. Last thing I want to mention about these two images, really the fun fact, is that we know that NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, he congratulated China for the successful landing of the Zhurong rover and lander a couple days ago, which does sound a little bit like rapprochement when you consider the fact that NASA was rather silent when China successfully sent the Tianhe Module of the Chinese space station into orbit a couple weeks ago. So that sounds like, a rather friendly remark, Nelson declared, notably in a statement. As the international scientific community of robotic explorers on Mars grows, the United States and the world look forward to the discoveries Zhurong will make to advance humanity's knowledge of the red planet. But at the same time, a couple days ago, at a Congress hearing, Nelson also brandished one of the images that were shot by Zhurong, and he declared, "I want you to see this photograph. I think that's now adding a new element as to whether or not we want to get serious and get a lot of activity going in, landing humans back on the surface of the moon." So Well, it's no scoop that generally, a competition between superpowers tends to push forward these space exploration programs and notably their budgets. I think this remark overall was perceived rather negatively by China as a sign that the U.S. is rather reluctant to see China's space program succeed. So that's all for me, Blaine. I know that also yesterday when we were preparing the episode, we received additional photos from CNSA of pictures coming from Zhurong. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, or just any thoughts you have on Zhurong?
Yeah, no, certainly. And just first point, NASA Administrator Nelson, that image kind of, it brought to mind, I don't know, kind of like scenes in a movie where you have someone trying to get an emotional reaction out of someone else by showing them a photo of some person, except in this case, it's just a machine. It's a rover on Mars. It is an inanimate object, essentially. And so it's kind of, it was an interesting sight for sure. But yeah, so to your point about the photos that were released yesterday. So indeed, yesterday we did see the Zhurong rover drive down the ramps that were extended by the lander. And that was, again, really perilous looking. Another kind of movie-ish reference where you'd have those kind of rope bridges that the main character never really wants to cross. And then when you consider that the Zhurong rover would have been a couple 100 kilograms, that must have been a very excruciating, slow few minutes, and indeed a commentary on the extent to which everything in space is really freaking hard, including just rolling down a couple of tracks onto the surface of Mars. That being the case, Zhurong did successfully drive down and is now in direct contact with the Martian soil, which must be a great feeling after a 7-month interplanetary expedition. The rover conducted a number of maneuvers, and it will soon kind of be driving off to explore the red planet. And in the process, to Jean's point, we did see a couple of additional shots that were pretty fascinating. So namely, you got some further shots from the front hazard avoidance camera as Zhurong goes down the ramp, and you can see the Martian soil getting closer and closer, which was a little bit similar to the video that was released by NASA some few months ago of Perseverance descending, and you kind of see the surface getting closer and closer, although this would have been from a much shorter starting point and at a much lower speed, I suppose. At the same time, you also had some shots that were taken, but from the rear hazard avoidance camera, so basically the opposite direction, and so you get a nice view of both sides, and you also get a nice shot of the lander itself, so really just an incredible sight, and I think something that is likely to inspire people not only in China, but in quite a few different places around the world. So really a very cool and inspirational mission. Let's see, any other points on my side? I guess, I mean, really just the 16-bit per second data rate is pretty astonishing. That's what, 32 binary numbers basically per second? I mean, is that what we're meant to derive from that? So that's, I guess, I hope that the rover does not have any expectations of, high definition videos or anything like that being broadcast to Mars for its viewing pleasure. That's enough kind of jokes about the inanimate object that is or is not, in favor of it. Digressing, the Zhurong rover is far from the only major space mission going on with China right now. So it might not even be the most major, indeed, if we look at the 20-ton space station that is currently in orbit. So as we discussed a couple of weeks ago on the Dongfang Hour, episode 31, China recently launched the Tianhe 1 core module of the Chinese space station. And in the weeks since, we have begun to see tests being done by inside of Tianhe in preparation for the arrival first of the cargo, the Shenzhou cargo vessel, and then later of the crew vessel as well. Sorry, the Tianzhou cargo vessel, and then the Shenzhou crew vessel. So, Jean, do you want to let us know what's going on with Tianhe this week as it prepares for the arrival of its first guests, as it were? Yeah,
definitely. I think that this was the other big activity of the week of the Chinese space program. It happened in Leo, and so, as you said, the Chinese completed a number of tests of the Chinese space station, of the Tianhe core module. And the main reason, as you said as well, is because we will see a Tianzhou cargo resupply as well as a Shenzhou crewed mission dock to the core module in the coming weeks. And so these tests that it's been undergoing over the past few weeks included things, systems that were linked to in orbit and a rendezvous and docking, the life support systems also that are linked to the taikonaut living quarters. There was also the robotic arm, which plays a really essential role in the for the Chinese space station. And speaking of the robotic arm, I just wanted to go take a minute or two to dig a little deeper into this very interesting piece of space science. And it does look a little bit with some similarity to the Canadarm that you already have on board the International Space Station. So quick rundown of this robotic arm. It was designed by CAST's Fifth Academy, also known as CAST, China Academy of Science and Technology. It's composed of 2 main shafts, which form an elbow. It has 7 rotary joints and a number of effectors and cameras at the end of this arm. It's 10 meters long, and it can be extended to 15 meters. And some of the very cool features that I'd like to single out here is that, first of all, it can use its cameras to monitor what's going on externally of the Chinese space station. And typically this can be for maintenance purposes. It can also be for approaching visiting spacecraft. It can also be used to move huge masses around, and this includes cargo and equipment, as well as the future experimental substations that will dock to the Tianhe core module. It can also move taikonauts around when they perform EVA, extravehicular activity. It does look kind of fun. And there's also this very cool so-called crawling maneuver. And basically, rather than making this huge robotic arm that can reach out to any place on the space station, but which would have been extremely heavy, here, rather, they made a compact robotic arm, so 10 to 15 meters. But on the other hand, they have multiple connection points all over the Chinese space station. And so the robotic arm can move from one place to another if it wants to reach an area that's farther from its initial reach. So yeah, that's about it for me for these different features of Tianhe, the completion of these tests in preparation for Shenzhou and Tianzhou in the coming weeks. Definitely some very cool stuff.
Yeah, and I have an article that I will discuss here from the local media in just a moment on this. But I guess one thing that came to mind when you were mentioning the crawling maneuver is just the I guess the modular aspect of the new space station, and just the extent to which it is being built to be highly flexible. And the other, I guess, project that I have been reading about recently that I believe is also going to be kind of it will be attachable for the space station is the Shuntian Space Telescope. Yes, they're building this huge space telescope that's going to be able to move around low Earth orbit, but then if it needs to be repaired, or if it otherwise needs docking for any other reason, it can just dock with the space station. So I do think it's there's a lot of ingenuity that's gone into making the space station modular and flexible, and other things that are generally very, very nice to have if you have something that weighs 20 tons and is in low Earth orbit. It makes it rather hard to make changes once it's already there. So the more modularity and flexibility, probably the better. But yeah, overall, some really incredible stuff this week about Tianhe, and very much looking forward to the upcoming launch next week, most probably of the Tianzhou cargo craft. And so again, getting back to the article in the local news about this. So in the South China Morning Post this week, we saw an article about U.S. concerns regarding the aforementioned robotic arm. And the concerns were actually raised earlier this year by James Dickinson, who's the commander of the U.S. Space Command, in a congressional hearing. And he was talking about the potential for this robotic arm to be able to grab passing spacecraft, and other kind of nefarious things that one might do with a robotic arm, which sounds pretty... Like that, I'd be interested. It'd be an astonishing thing to see. I mean, it'd be like somebody in the outfield of a baseball game with a baseball glove and the ball. I mean, like, this is something that's moving very, very fast and presumably is very heavy. I mean, it's so yeah. And then the article mentioned, and this is something that I will do a little bit more digging into myself, but the fact that the Shenzhou 17 satellite, which was launched a number of years ago, apparently had a similar robotic arm technology. So this is something that has been on the radar of the U.S., I guess, defense establishment for some time. Overall, it seems like another relatively small sticking point between the U.S. and China in the space domain, and these relatively small sticking points are just kind of starting to accumulate, but such is life. Either way, again, very much looking forward to seeing the Tianzhou launch hopefully next week, and then the eventual arrival of the first taikonauts to the space station later on this summer. Jean, anything else from you on the Tianhe space station, or shall we move into SASTIND ruining the Buddha's birthday?
Let's hear about that.
Indeed. So I was a little bit interested this week. Wednesday, 19th of May, is the Buddha's birthday, which is a public holiday in Hong Kong, also apparently in South Korea. It is not, however, a holiday in mainland China, apparently. And we found this out because the State Administration for Science, Technology, and Industry for the National Defense, SASTIND, was apparently still hard at work on Wednesday, the Buddha's birthday, publishing regulations. And as it turns out, regulations of a space variety. So Wednesday this week, we saw SASTIND publish their notice on promoting the orderly development of small satellites and strengthening national safety, or the 关于促进微小卫星有序发展和加强安全管理的通知. And so a lot to unpack here on this very fast-moving topic. So the first point I would bring up is that the timing is pretty interesting, if not borderline impeccable. So this notice, it is basically trying to make some of the regulations around building small satellites more clear. And this comes just a few weeks after the establishment of China SatNet, which is the operating company for China's large broadband constellation that is going to be launched over the next handful of years. And so when thinking about, what does one need in order to build a very large LEO broadband constellation, the answer is likely going to include something like, a large manufacturing base that can build lots of satellites. And at the moment, China has a number of different satellite manufacturers that have been building up capabilities, but there have not been a lot of clear regulations made about what these manufacturers do and don't need to do. And so with this publication of these regulations that are an attempt to clear up some of the ambiguity, I think the timing is quite good. I suspect, although this is highly speculative, but I suspect that the creation of SatNet may lead to more political will to do certain types of reform in the industry, because the existence of SatNet implies a certain level of political will to open up the satellite manufacturing space. So again, first point, interesting timing for sure. The second point I think is, so at a high level in terms of regulation in China, I would point out that a lot of Chinese space companies are very cautious as it relates to regulation. And we've discussed this before, but this is to say that until the regulations around something are clarified, most companies tend to be quite conservative about doing that thing. And this is somewhat different to the US or the West in general, where regulations are important, but companies are a little bit more, I guess you could say, cavalier about doing things that push the envelope a little bit on regulations. And the last point I would bring up is that this is I think these regulations are very useful for clarifying ambiguity around the manufacturing of small satellites, and I think this is very helpful for launching a large broadband constellation. But I do think that the other element of this that we still have not seen very much regulatory clarification on is the launch side of things. And one of the other very important things that you need to launch a very large constellation is a lot of rockets. And we saw in this release of this document a little bit of clarification around launch, but it was primarily related to what do satellite manufacturers need to do in order to launch. And so again, I think moving forward, I would not be hugely surprised if we saw some rather similar sort of clarifying regulations coming from some high-level government body as it relates to launch. So yeah, John, anything from your side on SASTIND and their work on the Buddha's birthday?
Not on Buddha, but on the document itself, several things caught my eye when I was skimming through this document. The first one was the emphasis that was put on a responsible use of space. Definitely a very topical subject. And these regulations apparently definitely will have to be taken very seriously by Chinese space satellite companies. And SASTIND makes it very clear that it will be mandatory to provide a clear space debris mitigation plan alongside any application for a launch service for a given satellite. So I thought that was a first interesting point. The document also, clarifies points on frequency applications, on a little bit on launch, as you said, and also had additional security and licensing regulations that these satellite companies will have to follow. I found it interesting that satellite manufacturers building satellites above 500 kilograms were sort of singled out as needing special authorizations, as well as any company that would be working on satellite power supply and propulsion subsystems. Satellites above 500 kilograms, that's probably a minority of satellites that will be built in the coming years by commercial companies, considering that most of, in terms of numbers, the biggest amount will be coming from the large broadband SATCOM satellites. And if China's big broadband constellation Guoang follows the steps of Starlink, these will be satellites that are below 500 kilograms. So there's that. I did also notice something that looked like an encouragement to launch on domestic launch vehicles. And if we push the interpretation a bit further, it looks like an encouragement to launch on actually long March rockets. And the exact phrase is, is 鼓励利用国家任务配套运载火箭. So yeah, the 国家任务运载火箭, 国家任务 meaning national mission, national task, and 运载火箭 launch vehicle, definitely, national mission launch vehicle. That sounds a lot like Long March, but maybe this is just speculation, and I'm happy to hear any thoughts from listeners or viewers on this point. So definitely an encouragement to, at the very least, use domestic launch vehicles, and maybe potentially also specific ones among the domestic launch vehicles.
Indeed. Well, I mean, I will be, whenever the next public holiday in Hong Kong, but not public holiday in mainland China is, that's where I'm going to circle my calendar and say SASTIND is going to pick that day to do their launch regulation update. That being said, if I can now stop speculating on the actions of SASTIN, because I don't think that's a very fun game to get into. Our last piece of news on this week. So we have an interesting opinion piece that was seemingly published by Ming, the founder and CEO of Galaxy Space, one of China's leading commercial satellite manufacturers. And this opinion piece was written on the topic of China SatNet. So again, that aforementioned operating company of China's large LEO broadband constellation, which was the company being founded just a few short weeks ago. And so, again, this article appeared on Galaxy Space's official WeChat account, with the author being Ming, company CEO. And the title, China SatNet is coming at the right time. And so first, just a little bit of background on Ming and why is he significant. So I would point out that first, most of the founders of most of China's commercial space companies, mostly they're coming from a traditional space background or some kind of academic type background like the Chinese Academy of Sciences, or in some cases, maybe ex-military type people. This is not the case for Galaxy Space. So Ming, the founder and the CEO, his background was that he was an early employee at a mobile app and sort of cybersecurity company called Tianhe Module. And this company is trading on the New York Stock Exchange, and its valuation at one point was about $5 billion US. So Ming, very different background from most of the founders in Chinese aerospace, in that he comes from kind of a consumer tech background. Tianhe Module itself has kind of an interesting history. So the company was founded by the current Bilibili CEO and co-founder Chen Ri, and it soon attracted significant backing from Kingsoft and from Tencent. And so Kingsoft may sound a little bit familiar to discerning Dongfang Hour listeners. We did a bit of a deep dive on Kingsoft back in the Dongfang Hour episode 24 in mid-March, when we spoke about none other than Lei Jun, the former CEO of Kingsoft, as well as a prominent financial backer and supporter of Galaxy Space and Ming. So now this brings us back to Ming. And so how and when Ming and Lei Jun came to know one another is not particularly clear, but sometime around mid-2018, Ming left Tianhe Module, with the company facing uncertain circumstances soon after, and there's a couple of articles that we'll include in the show notes. And very soon after that, so again, like mid-2018, Galaxy Space appeared on the scene, founded by Ming. And the company has since pivoted from what was originally very much we want to launch our own constellation, focusing on 5G and IoT and all these other nice buzz phrases, to now what is more of we want to build satellites and also potentially build satellites to sell to someone else who's building their own constellation, while at the same time using the skills that we, Galaxy Space or whomever, have in IoT, in 5G, and start to develop applications for these satellites. And so really kind of a pivot from the original plan to more of again, kind of satellite manufacturer and kind of application development company plan. And so now getting back to the piece from Ming, and who's talking about, again, the foundation of SatNet and why it's at the right time. So a couple of interesting points come up. So first of all, Ming points out that LEO constellations and the associated spectrum is by and large first come, first serve. And so that is companies like SpaceX, Amazon, OneWeb, Telesat, and a handful of other Western firms have applied for what is pretty limited spectrum, and they plan to, or already have begun, launching satellites into what is limited orbital space. And so basically, in the words of Ming, and I paraphrase here, you're in kind of this land grab phase right now for low Earth orbit spectrum and space. And so, hey, we need to grab some of that land, as it were. And so SatNet at this particular point in time, great timing. Tend to agree. The second interesting point is that Xu Ming highlights the fact that the Chinese space sector has evolved very rapidly, but that this evolution has primarily been based on more kind of science and technology type of projects, and that by creating what he distinguishes as a more kind of industrial type of project, this building out a national broadband network, a little bit more of a commercial element to that, he points out this would be the first major such project undertaken by the Chinese space industry. So almost like a public-private partnership sort of thing, except not quite. But anyway, I think it's an interesting point that by building out a space ecosystem that is itself conducive to commercial usage, so having this satellite broadband network, China will in some way implicitly be opening up the space sector a little bit to more commercial involvement, at least on an application side. And so just to kind of summarize, I definitely agree with Xu Ming's statement in general that this is a good time to be launching a concentrated effort like SatNet. I also do think that the incentive structure seems to be pretty interesting in the sense that SatNet is a directly controlled subsidiary of SASAC, as opposed to being a subsidiary of, say, CASC or CASIC. And it might even be close to an optimal incentive structure. I don't really know, but it seems quite okay. So yeah, John, anything from your side on Xu Ming or SatNet or Kingsoft or Leijun? One of the... Yeah.
I'll try to be short because I see we're past the 30 minutes mark here. And nothing really more on Galaxy Space or Xu Ming, but to expand a little bit on your point of SatNet having its independence. I think that we saw further points on this in the past week. We saw, for example, that Ge Xiaochun was named the CFO of China SatNet, and Ge Xiaochun is a guy that comes from a high-level engineering background. From CNSA. He does not come from CASC, which is the main contractor in China for space stuff. And we also saw in the past weeks, and this was discussed in Dongfang Hour newsletter issue number 2, that all the other top level directors came from a wide variety of backgrounds, including CASC, obviously, but also K6, CTC, and CEC. So really the top level management is a mix of all state-owned enterprises, and the fact that you also have China SatNet that is not dependent of CASC, but is an independent SOE under SASAC. That definitely suggests that it is, it's more free in its decisions. And another point that is suggestive of this is that China SatNet's deputy director last week, Mr. Tang Yagong, he visited X-Space's facilities in Wuhan, which shows that China SatNet very likely has also some interest in non-CASC, so non-long march launch vehicles. And definitely, I think this would have been unimaginable if, had SatNet been a direct subsidiary of CASC. So just expanding a little bit on your points here, I definitely agree on CASIC actually being more of an independent SOE rather than a traditional CASC subsidiary as you might have expected at the beginning.
Indeed. Well, what a week this has been. And once again, a reminder that we have about 8 additional news stories that we were not able to get to this week. And if you have any interest in reading about those, do check out the newsletter. We have seen a roughly 1,200% increase in subscribers since last week. And that is from a very low starting point, but nonetheless, 1,200% per week. If we can keep that up, pretty soon we'll just have the entire internet under our purview. So thank you all for your continued support. We hope this has been an interesting episode and enlightening discussion, and looking forward to seeing you next week. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville, and this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and see you next week.